Well, thank you for the very kind introduction and the kind invitation, too. This is a fascinating conference covering lots of different modalities, and I find myself like a kid in a candy store wandering around over the last little while. First of all, can everyone hear me okay? Is the mic set well? All right, I'll try not to blow your ears off when I get excited. My topic today is the rapid imaging renaissance. And for those of you who may not have known or believed that we are in a renaissance, I'm going to try to convince you today that in fact we are. The subtitle is Sparser Samples, Denser Dimensions, and Glimmerings of a Grand Unified Tomography. A slightly ambitious title, but we'll see how well I do in justifying that in your minds. As you heard, I represent NYU School of Medicine, our Center for Biomedical Imaging there, and a new Center for Advanced Imaging Innovation and Research. First of all, some disclosures. There are some patents that I'm involved with, and we also have a collaborative research agreement, a very productive one with Siemens Medical Solutions. Okay, so here is my roadmap for today. I'm going to start pretty far at the beginning with a brief history of imaging. Given this crowd, of course, this will be a highly targeted history, don't worry. And then I'll move into a history of rapid imaging. But there has been sort of a new disruptive influence on the horizon for some time now, that of compressed sensing. And so I'm going to move right into talking about sparsity and incoherence and the rise of compressed sensing as really a multimodality enabler. I'm going to talk about many guises of sparsity. I'm going to give you some examples largely from MR, which is my biggest background, but also from CT and from PET. And then I'm going to talk about what I think is a new set of directions that the field is moving towards rapid continuous imaging, rapid comprehensive imaging, and ultimately tying it all together, what I think of as the rapid imaging renaissance, imaging 2.0, you might say, although I've just recently been informed that the ACR is already up to imaging 3.0, so let's call it imaging 4.0 for the purposes of today. First of all, I want to start with this. All of us who are in this room, presumably, and do imaging are, in a sense, spies. Now, alas, we're probably not quite as well known or dashing as 007 shown up here. Our life expectancy is probably a little longer, but why do I say we're spies? Well, we all try to gather information in space and in time and map it out. We acquire encoded signals and we decode them. For those of you who have seen the Imitation Game, we have perhaps a little bit akin to that. We aim to pierce the veil of the skin, the skull, the cell, whatever's blocking our vision to see what was once invisible. Okay, so let's start with a history of imaging. And I might argue that it started sometime around here. Let's go back to 540 million BC when the humble trilobite evolved its compound eye. Obviously, you can't really have what you might call imaging without the observer, but the eye is very interesting. If you notice, it's highly parallel, lots of different facets, each gathering a piece of the image at once. A pretty darn good invention. If we move up to, okay, the date is now subject to a dangerous dispute that I won't go into, but let's say around 3 million BC, these eyes evolved attached to this slightly different organism here, which had also evolved a slightly better image processing workstation than the trilobite. But the eyes I've borrowed are those of Louis-Jacques Daguerre, who in 1837 created this device, the daguerreotype, the camera as we know it. Then, of course, go to 1895, Röntgen made a relatively substantial addition to our portfolio. And, of course, there were many improvements in the subsequent century to all manner of imaging, including the photographic imaging approaches shown here. It took us till the 70s, interestingly enough, to get to modalities like MR and CT, and there's some interesting connections between them I'm going to talk about. Another way of organizing things, of course, is by the probe that's used to interact with the body you want to image. So the pin on my lapel, and perhaps on some of yours, says it is the year of light. Light, obviously, was sort of our inaugural probe, and there are many modalities you can see up there associated with it. X-rays, obviously, led to CT. Radio tracers, electromagnetic fields, in which category I class MRI. and mechanical displacements, and the list can go on. Just about any displacement and any probe you can think of, we can imagine to image. What I'm going to focus on today are some of the tomographic modalities, i.e. the modalities that are based on reconstruction from multiple projections through an object. And here I've just thrown up two images from two Nobel Prize-winning inventions, those of MR and CT. And one of the things that you can see is that they are actually remarkably simple, even though the communities are highly disparate. The basic reconstruction problem from projections, it looks as if they could be describing essentially the same thing. And so my first, perhaps a little controversial hypothesis is that there's not really much new under the sun in tomography. Though the probes and the corresponding imaging modalities may vary, and though the methodology of particular modalities are advancing like crazy, otherwise why would we all be here, the conceptual underpinnings of tomographic imaging have in many ways remained fixed for decades. But I would add, until recently. So let's carry on and see if you agree with me. So let's move now to rapid imaging. Now, some might argue one of the ways imaging has changed dramatically is part of its natural evolution. It is in the nature of an imaging modality to accelerate. Over time, people figure out clever new ways to move imaging faster. So we see the evolutionary path here. And why is this? Well, certainly from a clinical point of view, there's a strong need for speed. Patients and organs move. So slow images are blurred images. Injected contrast agents move. We need to follow them through the course of the vessels. Patients get restless. Long breath holds aren't feasible, particularly those for those with respiratory disease or cardiac disease. Time is money. If there are any chairs of radiology departments in the audience, they are aware of this fact quite acutely. But also, perhaps more importantly, time is information, and this is true in research as well. If we have greater efficiency, then we can get more information per unit time. So let me now run through what I think of as sort of a brief history of rapid MRI and CT. And MR and CT actually underwent a really strikingly similar evolution in many ways. First of all, from the founding in the 70s, I would say the first order of business was getting the hardware together. And from the MR point of view, it was the gradients that really drive a lot of the speed, somewhat the field strength as well. But being able to switch those gradients fast. In CT, it's getting that gantry spinning up like crazy. But there's also the acquisition sequence, which is important. And in MR, that's a pulse sequence. In CT, for example, helical acquisition was a major breakthrough, and you can look at the very fast, say, spiral or EPI MR pulse sequences and juxtapose them to helical CT in some ways. So it took us till the 90s, a little bit embarrassingly, to figure out that we could gather not just one point of data at a time in a traditional sequential order, but many points of data at once, and therefore speed things up if we could use multiple detectors at once. So in MR, RF coils, and CT detector rows, these developments occurred at the same time without really talking to each other. This was the area that I was privileged to be able to participate in early in my career. And so here are the RF coils, or the CT detector rows. Interestingly enough, both modalities went through what I would call channel wars at that time. Who has more channels? Is it 16? Is it 32? Is it 64? Is it 128? This was a nice sort of leverage point for manufacturers. But also people started to realize that we were moving towards arguably some limits of practical acceleration with these approaches. So you could argue that we had kind of settled out. The field had gotten quite mature since 1970. Things were starting to get a little bit staid. Or maybe not. Because in the last decade or so, something has come along and changed the landscape. What is that something? I would argue that that is the general concept of sparsity, or compressed sensing. And I think we live now in what I would call the era of sparsity, a post-Nyquist, for the traditionalists among us, very confusing but highly productive and engaging era. So let's talk about that a little bit, but let's first look at some of the sort of outcome in terms of raw speed. Okay, so if we go back to 2005, we were very happy with parallel imaging to get improved breath hold imaging, twofold accelerations. We get some blurring artifacts from failed breath hold here that are removed in that image. We were very pleased with that. That was kind of standard on all MR scanners. Jump forward to 2015. I'm going to show you a lot more about this example later. The accelerometer has moved up to a factor of 20, combining compressed sensing and parallel imaging, getting whole volumes with just a few second temporal resolution. Similarly, in the breast, we were very excited to improve spatial resolution, for example, in the same time with a factor of 1.5 or 2. Now we're talking, once again, factors closer to 20, watching the inflow of contrast with high spatial and temporal resolution in the entire breast volume. OK, so how's this done? How do we do this? So let's talk a little bit about this disruptive new kid on the block, compressed sensing, and then go on to some examples. By the way, this is the part of my talk that I refer to as the sparser samples, this compressed sensing angle. So let's look for just a second what happens when we undersample our signals in MR, just to use the example most familiar to me. So if we have a fully sampled signal on the left here, we Fourier transform it, we get the nice fully sampled image. I've shown 3 different voxels here, boom, boom, boom. If we undersample, if we leave out every second or every 2 out of 3 lines in this kind of pattern, what happens? We get aliasing. Nyquist kicks in. Those voxels are condensed into one, and we can't tell what comes from where. Can they be unfolded? Well, Professor Nyquist says, nuh-uh, not going to happen. Fundamental principles suggest, in this case, that you cannot unalias without more information. Of course, parallel imaging does that. Parallel imaging, parallel MRI, unfolds folded data or fills in the missing lines. But Professor Nyquist is still happy because we've gathered more information. We have information from multiple coils. So we actually haven't violated Nyquist at all. But now let's consider what happens when we undersample in an irregular pattern. Okay, so we take a random subset here. We take out that subset. The full image here gets converted into this kind of fuzzy-looking image there. Not very pretty. Not many people would like to read through that. You can still see the features, but, not ideal. What compressed sensing contends is that we can do this. With appropriate processing, we can go backwards from this ugly image here without any additional coils and recover full image content. Is Professor Nyquist happy? Rolling over in his grave. Not happy at all. This is a frank violation, it would appear, of the Nyquist criterion. Many of us, when we first saw this, thought this is magic. What, you got a black box and you have not enough data, and all of a sudden, poof, out comes the full image. There was even someone who won our Not-So-Nobel Prize at an ISMRM back a few years for suggesting extreme compressed sensing with no data. Okay, well, obviously, it has some purchase, so it's probably not fully magic. So let's talk about the invention of compressed sensing. This happened around 2006. Emmanuel Candes, David Donahoe, Tao as well. The basic idea is we can control how we undersample, and most images or signals are simpler than we think when viewed from the right perspective. And when you combine this, you can get some serious mileage out of it. Sparsity and compressed sensing were introduced very quickly afterwards into MRI by this fellow here, my colleague Mickey Lustig, who has a seminal paper on this. And the basic idea behind compressed sensing is the same sort of idea that's behind image compression, which we use, of course, all the time, right? I mean, it's an essential tool for modern data storage. Anytime we take a picture on our phone, we're asked whether we want to send it small, medium, or large in email. All of those kinds of compressions are being used all the time, and the reason is because images, including medical images, are highly compressible. If you look at a brain, you do a wavelet transform, you can cut off 9/10 of the coefficients and still get a very nice-looking image. You can do even better when the image is moving. MPEG does even better than JPEG. And so you can maybe compress, say, 20 times and still get a really nice, reliable-looking image. Which leads to the nagging question, if we can compress by a factor of 10, why are we acquiring all of this data so laboriously? Why are we going through point by point by point to make a voxel for each data point? It seems kind of silly. The answer is that all of those compression techniques have prior information. They know the full image content. So you can analyze it, figure out which components are important and which not, and toss out the ones that are not. What we want to do is we want to do it prospectively, right? We want to toss out, we want to pre-compress. We want to toss out the information we don't need in advance so we don't have to acquire it at all. For that, we need some kind of prior information. And so the image content, as I said, is known in image compression. If we knew the image structure was really, really simple, like if we knew a priori the image was a linear gradient like this, how many points would we need to acquire? How many data points would we need to acquire to characterize the entire image? Well, we'd need 2, right? We just need to specify the slope of the line, and then we're done. So clearly, we were looking for some prior information, but we don't want to overlook a lesion. We don't want to make some fake argument. So what do we know for sure about any particular medical image? Well, what we know for sure about any medical image is that it's compressible. And maybe a little bit about how, but we don't know a priori where. We don't know a priori which parts of the image are dense or not, which coefficients in a transform are important. The beauty of compressed sensing is that it uses that prior information and not much more. It basically builds the notion of data compression directly into the acquisition. How does it do this? 3 basic ingredients. Sparsity. The images need to be sparse in some known domain that you can transfer in and out of. Incoherence, so you want to undersample, not in a regular way, but as I showed in my early example, and random-looking way. And you need some form of nonlinear reconstruction. So let me give you a very practical example, and these are beautiful slides that I took from Mickey Lustig to explain this, and then we'll move on to the more advanced applications. So the idea is, let's say you gather data in K-space in MRI, no undersampling. If you Fourier transform it, you get just these 3 lines. We have a simple one-dimensional image, okay? Just 3 lines that we want to recover. Now let's say we undersample regularly. We leave out lines in this pattern. Well, what's going to happen is those 3 true points are going to alias on top of each other. So you see, we get this mishmash. The blue and the yellow are on top of each other. We really can't tell what's what. But what about what happens if we undersample randomly? Well, if we undersample randomly, those red and blue peaks still are sitting above what we would call the pseudo-noise. It's not really noise. It's because we've undersampled randomly. So now what can you do? Well, if you take a reconstruction, you undersample the signal, you create all this pseudo-noise, this buzz in the background. Now we do a threshold, right? Let's say we have a reasonable guess of where to set that threshold. We'll do it very conservatively at first. We then take out just those 2 peaks. OK, that's great, but we're missing the yellow, so we've lost the lesion. That's not good. But wait, we can go back. We can undersample those 2 points in the way that we know we undersampled. And we can get the pseudo-noise associated with those points. We can then go back and subtract that from the original. And when we do, lo and behold, we take out a lot of that fuzz. And our yellow line is now poking up above the new pseudo-noise. So if we just repeat the process, we set another conservative threshold. In those 2 steps, in this extremely simple case, we've gotten back to our perfect image without corruption. That's the magic of compressed sensing. It's using the knowledge that there's sparsity to try to search, in this case iteratively, search for the best result. Make sense? So in actual practice, mathematically, how we deal with that is we simply take our usual linear reconstruction, this 2 norm here, the data consistency term, so EX minus Y, X is the true image, Y is the data, E is the transform between them. We take the mean square difference, but then we use a regularization term. And the regularization term here typically is a 1 norm, a sum of absolute magnitudes. Ideally, we'd want a 0 norm. We just want to count the number of non-vanishing components, but that turns out to be hard. So it's been shown that you can do it with one norm. Anyway, it's a simple regularization. You do an iterative reconstruction, and you accomplish that sort of successive thresholding, more or less, that I've told you about. So this is just saying I'm looking for the image that is consistent with the data, that is also the sparsest allowable without introducing inconsistencies in whatever domain you wish it to be sparse in the wavelet domain, in the image domain, in the Fourier transform domain, you choose, as long as you know what type of image it is. What are the limits? It's a natural question. Well, the maximum acceleration depends upon the underlying degree of sparsity. So it's a little different than the usual case. We can't just sort of say, we know the number of voxels we want, so that's the number of acquisitions we need. We need to know something, based on experience about the degree of sparsity. For a single detector channel, generally speaking, if you have this incoherent sampling, the number of samples has to be about 3 to 5 times the number of sparse coefficients. And this is something that the mathematicians who came up with this demonstrated quite nicely. It turns out for multiple detector channels, if you want to say combine this with parallel imaging, that number of samples per coil goes down closer to 1. So it's actually a nice thing to bring together with parallel imaging. This is multi-channel compressed sensing. So let's talk for a second before we go on to now the examples. What are the consequences of the compressed sensing perspective? Because you can say, okay, so we can reconstruct a little better. It turns out it's had a much bigger effect on the field, certainly of MR, and it's spreading many places. I've seen, obviously, there was a session on compressed sensing here. I've seen it in a number of different modalities, even in the talks I've seen here this week. First of all, it's not just about data sufficiency anymore. It's not just about how many voxels you want. It's about information content. It's the number of significant components. But there's also an interesting paradox introduced by compressed sensing, the paradox of dimensionality. In the era of sparsity, bigger, more diverse data sets are better. Why? Because more dimensions means you spread out the aliasing in more different directions. You're sparser, and you have more incoherence. So compressed sensing is one of the few acceleration techniques that works better the more data you have, the more crazy complex the data is. Another principle that comes out of this is that you never want to repeat yourself. If you're taking a bunch of data, don't repeat it over and over and over in signal average. Take complementary data, and you'll see some concrete examples of that. You want to take advantage of temporal coherence and sampling pattern incoherence to get the best results. Okay. So let's switch now to some concrete examples in MR, CT, and PET. So here's an easy one. A 4-fold accelerated parallel image of the brain using, I believe, 4 coils. So it's really kind of pushing it to the limit of what parallel imaging can accomplish with just that small number of coils. We can do better with more, of course. But you can see it's a highly noisy image. If you now simply combine compressed sensing and parallel imaging, and this is work by Ricardo Otazo, you see the image just pops out beautifully from the noise. Very simple application. Ricardo extended this in some work in 2010 to do first-pass cardiac perfusion using a combination of parallel imaging and compressed sensing, in this case getting 8-fold acceleration, 10 slices per heartbeat. So you can get very nice images across the cardiac cycle as the contrast agent is flowing in, which you can see here. Now let me go back to this data set, which I showed you earlier on when we were comparing accelerations over the last decade. This is actually abdominal imaging with a radial acquisition approach. So we're taking our case-based data in MRI in a radial fashion, and as you'll see, I'll talk more about this later, and advancing golden angle radial. So each radial line fills in the biggest gap without repeating. Now we're talking 20-fold acceleration. Whole liver coverage. We can get the whole liver in 3 seconds. Probably better if we push it harder. Clinically acceptable, typical spatial resolution. And what you can see is we're not just resolving structure, we're resolving dynamics as well. Why is this? Why can compressed sensing do so well with this? In part because the time domain is highly compressible. Things don't just sort of jump suddenly from place to place in normal physics. So we know that we have nice degrees of correlation along the time domain that we can really take advantage of. You wouldn't want to try this as much in the spatial domain, but once we have the time domain, this is what I meant about dimensionality. Once you add the time domain all of a sudden you can reach accelerations that are beyond what we really could be comfortable with before. Okay, well that's MR, but the prospect of radial sampling in K-space might bring to mind for a number of us a CT acquisition, right? You've got a gantry that's moving around collecting angular projections. And so could you do the same kind of thing? Could you undersample in radial space, acquire half as many projections, but still get back the whole image? Well, if you did that, you'd have the whole image, but it would be at half the radiation dose, right? This has been bandied about in the field now for a while. So there have been a number of very, very foresightful proposals about ways to do precisely this with compressed sensing for dose reduction in CT. The problem up to now has really been figuring out a good way to do the undersampling. In MR, undersampling is easy. We just don't acquire the data. We just don't put on the gradient. And we can skip that point. In CT, you've got this moving gantry with a pretty significant inertia and a thermal inertia and all of those things as well. So it's actually kind of hard to turn on and off really fast. So we came up with this proposal, and this is a grant application that's still in the review process. So I'll tell you in a little while whether it's a good idea or not. But our idea here is to use a moving multi-hole collimator. So you've got the gantry zipping around. Now take a collimator that has sort of random holes poked in it and move it along so that at one angle of the gantry, you're selecting certain slices in your detector row, certain detector rows. And when you've moved to a different angle, it's advanced, and now you have different rows blocked, and so you're now selecting different detector rows as you move along. If you do that, you get a kind of incoherent undersampling, even though you are still coherently zipping around on the gantry. Just to show you some examples, so these are now data taken from relatively simple phantoms. Simple phantoms are dangerous in compressed sensing because they're really, really sparse, so they tend to perform really, really well. But this is no exception. So if you look, we have the full dose here with this kind of image quality. If we do an eighth dose with one of the state-of-the-art iterative reconstructions, Sapphire, you see that you can get very similar results at eighth the dose, which is very exciting. Now look at the compressed sensing result. Whoa. It's better than the full dose. And there are a number of you who should be thinking, oh, hold on, I don't believe that. It's true. It's true in part because this is a highly sparse phantom. So let me show you now an in vivo case. This is simulated because we don't yet have, the collimators to do this. But what you can see is at least you get a viable image at eighth the dose compared with full dose. So this is another way now that compressed sensing can play a role, this time in CT, for dose reduction. Now let's move to PET. At our center, we have an MR PET scanner, a Siemens MMR scanner, which simultaneously can acquire MR data and PET data. This is what it looks like on the inside. This is what it looks like on the outside. One of the questions that came to us when we first got this scanner was, well, wait a second. If we're now starting to move towards these radial data acquisitions in MR, in PET, you get 3D, essentially stochastic radial projections, and they're all acquired simultaneously. So why take the MR data from a simultaneous MR PET and pull it over here and reconstruct it, and then take the PET data and pull it over here and reconstruct it, and then co-register them, and maybe work them together? Why not actually try to do some sort of joint reconstruction? You'll see sparsity will come in just a second here. So one thing we did right off, and this is work by Thomas Kosters in our group, was take this continuous radial acquisition, this time in a different plane, so you can see the heart moving up and down on the diaphragm up there, sort that data, register it to some chosen frame, find the transformations that are required, and then simply apply the same thing to the PET, but in this case apply it in the PET reconstruction. Warp the lines of response so that we can actually now match these known deformations that we know from MR are happening to the common anatomy. And now we get a registered set of PET images, and it turns out if we do it this way, we don't have to average them together even if they're sort of automatically averaged in the reconstruction. And here's just an example. You can compare the uncorrected reconstruction, which is still relatively blurry, to a much sharper reconstruction with motion correction on top. So that's a way of using the continuously acquired MR data to improve the PET. We've been trying to go one step beyond that and now do a combined, a truly joint reconstruction of MR and PET using joint sparsity. What's joint sparsity? In this case, what we're saying is we know that the MR and the PET data, even though they are completely different modalities, completely different contrast mechanisms, we know they share a common anatomy. There can't be a heart in the PET image and not a heart in the MR image, unless you have some really weird contrast. So we expect that the differences between the MR and the PET image in some appropriate domain are sparse. In other words, there are clear differences, there are important differences, but the number of differences all told is not going to be equal to the number of pixels because there is a common anatomy underneath. And so when you enforce this joint sparsity, what you find is you can actually improve both the MR and the PET image. You can improve the point spread function of the PET image somewhat without incorporating the MR information directly. There are lots of techniques out there that are very powerful that try to use the MR as an anatomic ground truth. This is not saying whether MR or PET is an anatomic ground truth. It's just saying we know they share an anatomy. So this is another approach that you can take. This, by the way, is work of Florian Noll. And it was presented at ISMRM last year. OK, so there are some starting examples of what we can do with this kind of perspective and these kinds of tools in MR, CT, and PET. Let's think about what's next. First of all, if you think about the two things I've spent the most time talking about, parallelism and sparsity, there are precedents for both of them. If you think about it, we're really just learning from our own anatomy, our eyes and our brains. What do I mean by that? Well, our eyes are highly parallel detector systems. Remember the trilobite compound eye? We obviously have the photodetectors in the retina working highly parallel for us too. So as you're watching me and watching the screen, the scene is being streamed in simultaneously. Likewise, our brains are highly efficient data compression and information extraction devices. We're really good at seeing a face in just a small set of lines. So maybe these are relatively natural phenomena to start with. So what else can we learn from natural phenomena? Well, first of all, the world is dynamic, as is our experience of it. Seldom do we experience things in snapshots like we do in images. And the world is multifaceted. So the question is, can we design an imaging strategy to match these aspects of our experience? And that'll lead me to the second part of my talk here. I'm going to be talking about continuous imaging to capture the dynamic features and comprehensive imaging to capture the multifaceted features. OK, so continuous imaging, that's where denser dimensions comes in. So I've already mentioned that we like to do radial MRI at our center. Why? First of all, it's kind of robust to motion, so it crosses frequently, the data crosses frequently through the center of K-space, which means we're often getting a read on the DC value of the whole image. It's compatible with flexible continuous acquisition and has favorable undersampling properties. And Tobias Bloch is the guru of radial sampling at our center. But of course, there have been lots of people in MR who've done this. And in fact, Lauterber's first paper was a radial MR paper introducing the entire field. So what we do, as I had mentioned before, is continuous golden angle radial acquisition. We call this GRASP. Where we take this continuous golden angle acquisition, and you can see it fills in the biggest gap. So in a few lines, you can really cover a lot of the unit circle, if you will, but it never repeats. So if you did this forever, it would just keep on adding slightly complementary data. You combine compressed sensing and parallel imaging, and we can reconstruct with arbitrary temporal resolution. What does that mean? Well, we just acquired this continuous stream of angular projections, right? Then after the fact, we can decide, do we want a low temporal resolution but a really high fidelity, so we group lots of adjacent spokes together and we make this relatively small group of frames? Or do we really push the compressed sensing and parallel imaging harder and use a sparser set of projections and then get a higher temporal resolution? We can choose this after the fact. We don't need to worry about it at the time. And in fact, for that matter, we can start at any point and end at any point because there's no preferred start or end point in a golden angle radial acquisition. So this has some nice advantages. It gives us the grasp images I showed you here. And I'm highlighting now Hirsch Chandarana, who published this, this application of grasp in investigative radiology. And our clinicians love it. So by now, we've done thousands, literally, of patient scans with grasp. And you know, the pediatrician, the pediatric radiologist saw it and said, ooh, I want that for my moving kids. And the head and neck radiologist wanted it to follow contrast intake there and maybe deal with motion and abdominal imaging, you name it. So that's wonderful. That sounds a little bit like a pitch, like I'm trying to sell you grasp. It's not perfect, okay? What you see is that when you go for this low temporal resolution, you get intra-frame blurring. So you can see essentially like a little combination of multiple different slices that show up there. And if you go to high temporal resolution, you push the compressed sensing a little too hard, you can get blurring between frames. So the next improvement is a way to try to get around that. Basically what we do now, and this is called XD grasp, which stands for extra-dimensional grasp. That's the denser dimensions I'm talking about, for example. This is work that's now in press by Li Feng, a star grad student in our group. We can now do motion sorting rather than motion correction. So, as I said, those radial projections go through the center of K-space each time. So, in fact, if the lungs are expanding or the heart is beating, signal is moving in and out of our field of view, and the DC value changes. So we can just follow that DC value and actually see the motion state. We get a curve like this. And we can now, and basically we have this tagged for every line that we acquire. So we can then choose a set of bands describing a set of motion states, and we can resort our data using this. And this sort of self-calibration has been done, you know, in general in the field of MR for many, many years. But we can now resort our radially acquired data, and because it's golden angle acquired, we can very easily create a nice complementary set. They're not all clustered. They're nicely spread. And we can now that we've sorted them, we have more sparsity, more correlations along the time domain because we know where we are in the motion state. And to give you and first just to show you how is the reconstruction different, basically the difference is our regularization term, instead of just having one dimension, if we've sorted into two different dimensions, it now has two dimensions. So we have a second regularization parameter here. What do I really mean? Well, for example, you can separate out contrast enhancement and respiratory motion. So if you look at the center of K-space and you track it, it's going to look like this. Here's the respiratory motion, but obviously something's happening here, right? There's a contrast agent flowing in, and it's riding on top of it. So what we can do is remove that envelope, get the respiratory motion, sort that respiratory motion into different states. So what we have is a contrast enhancement dimension where things are getting brighter as the contrast flows in, and then we have a respiratory motion dimension, a complementary one, where the diaphragm is moving up and down. We can now exploit the correlations along both of those dimensions. We have a bigger dimensional data set, and compressed sensing works better. So for example, if we just do standard grasp, we can get this image of the aortic phase and the venous phase, but if we do XD grasp, for both of those phases of contrast enhancement, we can get multiple different motion states as the diaphragm is moving up and down. This, it should be emphasized, is for free. It's the same data. We've done nothing different except reconstruct it differently. And if you look, for example, you can see, I'm not sure how well it projects, but at least on my computer here, you can see the improvement in image quality from reduced averaging over multiple different diaphragm positions when you do this. You can do the same thing for cardiac imaging, and here you can take advantage of the fact that some coils that you might be using might be closer to the heart or closer to the abdomen. And so you can separate out, say, a respiratory signal from a coil near the abdomen and a cardiac signal at a higher frequency from a coil near the heart. And now you can sort not into contrast enhancement and respiratory, but cardiac motion and respiratory phases, right? And so this is a slide from Ricardo Otaza, which shows you nicely the heart is beating. It's expanding here, contracting here, but respiratory motion bounces the heart around. we can now separate out those two motions. So for example, we can see just the pure cardiac motion over there, or we can freeze the cardiac motion and just sit and watch what the heart does at a given cardiac phase with respiration. And you can see the septum moving back and forth and so on. And so here are some examples. This just shows you that you can now do an ungated, free-breathing cine that looks pretty much as good as a breath-held cine. And of course, if, person can't hold their breath, or if you just do it free-breathing in the normal way, you get a lousy-looking image. So we can do free-breathing. But one other exciting thing is we can start looking at arrhythmias. So you get this kind of lousy image over here in a patient with PVCs, premature ventricular contractions. But now what we can do is we can separate out, using this sorting, the normal cardiac cycle from the ectopic cardiac cycle. So we can actually get an uncorrupted normal heartbeat. And if we have enough of the PVCs, and they're consistent enough, we can actually also, from the same data set, get a pure look at the PVC and what's going on there. And like I said before, if you now freeze the cardiac motion and you sit and watch the respiratory motion along the respiratory dimension, watch this septum. I'll put my mouse there. See how it's moving back and forth? That's a phenomenon called LV-RV interaction that occurs due to pressure condition changes over the course of the respiratory cycle that some of our cardiologists were very excited to see for the first time. This was not data that could be easily visualized, certainly with MR, up till now. And this is work, all of this work, by the way, by Li Feng, who won a Young Investigator Award at SCMR for this back last year. Okay, as if that's not enough, I'll go just a little bit more for you. You can actually do even more with the same data. This same golden angle radial acquisition. This is something called low rank plus sparse matrix decomposition. You can essentially take all of your frames that you've acquired over time and stack them together and form a matrix. And Emmanuel Candes, who's one of the founders of compressed sensing, came up in 2011 with this decomposition, saying you can separate out a so-called low-rank component from a sparse component. So the low rank has few non-zero singular values. The sparse has few non-zero entries. And they can be robustly decomposed. This is also called robust principal component analysis. Sounds a little abstract. Let me show you a video that Emmanuel Candes, with whom we're now collaborating, made to demonstrate this beautifully. So if you look on the left, this is just video of people walking in a mall, going up and down an escalator. If you do this L plus S decomposition, what you see is you get kind of an average image. Note that it's not just a static image. The sort of periodic motion of the escalator is captured. But then you get these sparse innovations, the people walking and going down the elevator. So you can actually separate out those kinds of things. Well, why would we want to do this in imaging? Ricardo Otazo said, well, because there are many cases where we want to separate out the background from the innovations. So, for example, if you take an abdominal, contrast-enhanced abdominal imaging case here, you can see that with GRASP you get this. If you do the L plus S decomposition, here's L, which is essentially the background without any subtraction required. And S is really just what's new, largely the inflowing contrast. Why do we care? Well, remember with XD GRASP, we can capture the motion states. We can sort the data. With L plus S, we can do one better than that. It turns out that this low rank part gets much lower rank if you have correctly registered all the frames together. If you think about it, if the frames aren't moving with respect to each other, it's very, very low rank. There's not a lot of change over time. So Ricardo figured out a way to self-discover the motion vectors, the motion fields, that minimize the rank of this low rank part, L. And from that same data set, again, this is the same golden angle data set that you've seen before, he can now extract the deformation fields, the motion fields. So we now know not just the sorted data, but we can actually track the motion fields in a self-calibrated type of way. Okay. Good. I'm getting close, but still okay for time. So let me talk to you a little bit about rapid comprehensive imaging, and then I'll try to bring it all together. So there's been another sort of mini earthquake going on, certainly in the field of MR recently. in the area of multiparametric fitting. It used to be that you wanted to get a nice T1 map, you'd do a certain sequence, very carefully calibrated. You wanted to get a T2 map, you'd do that sequence, carefully calibrated. Now people are realizing that you can model temporal dynamics and in appropriate situations fit multiple physical parameters and derive multiple contrasts from the same data at once. Noam Ben Eliezer in our group has been doing this with T2 mapping, and there was a very well-known high visibility Nature paper by Mark Griswold's group on MR fingerprinting, and I'm going to tell you about that for a little bit here. And this is a beautiful image essentially showing a nice quantitative parameter map of the brain coming out of this ugly looking undersampled image via spin dynamics. But let me explain how this works. So this is all taken from Mark's work with his team. The idea is to do a complex pulse sequence, entangle multiple parameters, T1, T2, proton density, in a long pulse sequence. What this means is your spins are going to be doing some dance. They're going to be doing some spin, some spin gymnastics. And the idea is that different values of T1, T2, and so on will lead to distinct temporal fingerprints. The cool thing about it is undersampling artifacts, if you do a spiral or a radial sampling, tend to be incoherent with these fingerprints. So what you do is you take individual voxels of very highly undersampled, ugly-looking images. You then match them to a database of pure simulated spin dynamics with known parameters and outpop multiple quantitative maps of encoded parameters rapidly and simultaneously. So here's just showing from their paper, you have this awful-looking snapshot. I mean, nobody would want to read that image. But then you look over time and you get this funky-looking signature, this fingerprint. You compare it with a simulation, and out pops a nice high-res T1 map, B0 offset map, T2 map, and relative proton density multiplied by the received sensitivity. All of that out of a single monolithic sequence. Martijn Kloes in our group has upped the ante a little bit. That original work was done with a single transmit coil. Martijn has said, well, wait a second. I can throw the RF field into the mix as well. So I can take a bunch of different views, different illuminations of the object, if you will, with different coils that are spaced around the object, and hit it with one time, and then another time, and another time, and keep hitting it in this sort of random seeming way with different coils. It turns out this makes a more distinctive fingerprint, but what it also does is it allows you to map out the B1 fields as well. So this becomes an automatic B1 mapping on top of the T1 mapping and the T2 mapping and the proton density mapping. So here's an example at 7T, all done in 15 seconds. You have your T1 map, you have a T2 star weighting, you can get the T2 map as well, and you get your B1 maps, B1 plus maps from the coils out for free. If you tried to calibrate this on their own, it would take at least several minutes on their own to just get this kind of map traditionally. Here is an example at 9.4 Tesla, similar thing. And Martijn's recently been doing a lot of exciting work at 3T, showing you can get out, this is now two different modes of an elliptically driven birdcage coil. And you can see the B1 maps of those different modes and the T1, T2, and spin density. Here's a case of a patient with an implant. And you can see some of the artifacts here in the B1 plus map, but you get your parameter maps without distortion from that metal artifact, all out of one monolithic sequence. Okay. If you haven't completely abandoned me by now, we just have one more step, which is to bring all of these things together. And this is where the, unified tomography comes in. So I want to tell you about two things and then close for the day. First of all, this 5D XD grasp that Leah's been working on, and then a combination of MR fingerprinting with PET. So first of all, this 5D XD grasp for comprehensive cardiac MR, this is a very productive collaboration with the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, and also with Siemens Healthcare. The idea here is that cardiac MRI workflow is incredibly complex. For those of you who have done it, it's a royal pain. And for years, for decades really, the comprehensive cardiac exam has been the holy grail. But now what do? Well, you do a few breath holds for a short axis view for wall motion, a few breath holds for the long axis view. You want to get the aortic root and other things. You need still more breath holds, and there's complex planning in between each one. The idea is just do one acquisition continuously running and pull out all those things. The way Lee's been going about this in collaboration with Matthias's group is to use now a 3D generalization of the golden angle acquisition. So now it's called a spiral phyllotaxis trajectory. I won't go into detail. The nice thing is it has some of the same properties of the golden angle trajectory you saw in 2D, but it gives you comprehensive volumetric coverage with isotropic resolution, and it has nice incoherence in all spatial dimensions. So now take that old workflow and throw it out. Now the idea is you just acquire this 3D data set continuously. You can track motion if you want using XD grasp, and you will see that. And then after the fact, you want myocardial function in a short axis plane, no problem. Reconstruct that. You want it in a long axis, reconstruct it as well. That it's an isotropic data set, an isotropic temporally resolved data set. You want the arteries. You can get those as a function of time. The aortic function, okay. Pulmonary function. Aortic root cine. You can even look at the coronary arteries. And you could look at them at different phases of the respiratory motion or the cardiac motion. And so you can now do your classic MIP of the coronaries and get very nice coronaries. All of this was from one few-minute free-running sequence, self-calibrated. So if you look, say, in systole and diastole, you get all of these different views, including some nice coronaries, temporally resolved, again, all from one sequence. And this is work that Lee is going to be presenting at this upcoming ISMRM. Okay. Last example now, MRF PET, and this is Florian and Martijn in cahoots. So one of the things we found, ironically, when we got our MR PET scanner, is that the PET was actually short and sweet. It was the MR that was slowing things down. So the PET you do in a few minutes' time, but if you want to get a nice variety of contrast with MR, you do this acquisition, you do that acquisition, you throw in a flare, a T1. You can easily get up to a 30 to 45-minute protocol, whereas the PET, sure, we continue acquiring, but all we needed was 5 minutes of that to get a good PET image. What we really want is push a start button, and 5 to 10 minutes later after acquisition, we have the PET data and all of the MR contrasts we want. You see where this is going, multi-contrast. So the idea here is you do radial, continuous radial acquisitions like the golden angle radial I showed you, and you do fingerprinting. So you have these complex pulse sequences, you get fingerprints, and what we do in this case goes back to the joint reconstruction. So we have our PET data, we have our MR data, we do that joint reconstruction using a joint sparsity term. We get improved PET images compared to what you get alone. We get the reconstructed fingerprints. We match those to a database, and out come our quantitative maps of T1 and T2. And then if we want any particular contrast, well, if you have a quantitative map of T1 and T2, you just synthesize the contrast as it would have shown up in the brain. So essentially, you get out of this single 6-minute sequence the volume of information, in this case in a brain station, the PET image, slightly improved compared to what you get alone, the flare, the T2 weighted, the T1 weighted, and if you don't like those contrasts, you want to mix T1 and T2 a little bit, you can easily do that. Down the line, we'll just have a slider, so you can slide between the two as you want. This is a result in a patient with epilepsy, patient with a brain tumor. Again, you get the PET information, the quantitative maps, and any contrast you want to derive from them. So now imagine we link these two together. So now we have a fingerprinting acquisition. We have this 5D XD grasp type of sequence where we're tracking motion. Wouldn't it be nice to actually track both together? Usually in MR, we try very hard to separate our physiologic dynamics from our spin dynamics. We don't want the two to mix because the motion spoils our notion of what's happening with the spins. Here we actually can bring them together maybe and add PET into the mix. And if I'm sounding, Raye, go team enthusiastic, it's only because I find this to be a very exciting time. There is lots of work to be done here. This is a hard problem. But when it comes to the future of rapid imaging, and now I'm just going to close, I really think we're moving into a new era. As you heard, we are now, as I see it, in the era of sparsity. I think continuous comprehensive imaging, and we're seeing more and more of this in a number of examples across the field. I've cited a number of groups working on this in my talk, but if you look around, you will see 4D, 5D acquisitions cropping up everywhere using some of these tools that I've talked about. Really, as I see it, it's a new use of time in imaging. Basically, the old model, as you've seen before in cardiac, is, and now I'm showing in brain, you want a sequence, you plan that sequence, you want to move on to the next one, a T2 weighted, you plan that one and execute it, maybe an axial flare, a sagittal flare, a hemoflash, a diffusion. In between each of these, there's a delay as you're planning or executing. And God forbid the patient moves in the middle of one of the exams and you only discover it afterwards. You're going to have to call them back or just settle for bad data. What we're talking about now, if we continue along this line, is you have, again, comprehensive acquisition, including, say, MR and PET. Someone tell me how to do a combined MR, PET, and CT, and I will gladly try to bring that into the mix too. You go to the radiologist and say, well, what do you want to see? They say, I want to see these traditional views. From that data set, you reconstruct the views they wanted to see, but then they say, there's this funny lesion over here. It looks suspicious. I really wish you'd acquired a diffusion acquisition. No problem. You go to the data, and you pull out the diffusion, if you've been able to encode it. That's very hard with fingerprinting, but that's some of the future work. Or maybe you want to juxtapose it to the PET, and you have that in hand. So you have all of this comprehensive information to deal with. What this allows us, and there's a remarkable amount of technological complexity behind all this, it allows us ultimately an operational simplicity. And in fact, if you look at how somebody does a scan, prepares for an MR scan, to use the MR example, nowadays it's a little bit crazy. So we got our techs, and they're putting the patient in the scanner, and they're hooking up the lines and placing the particular coils just where you want them to get that particular set of slices right. And the coil's not right. Okay, maybe, yep, there it is. In they go. Great. Now you have to do the same thing with the computer. So now you have to choose your coil sets and choose your acceleration factors. And here's a little movie of one of our technologists who's very fast at it, doing the planning. Okay, you see, angling things here. This is one of the reasons why, MR is so specialized. You need to know all of these things just in order to do the scan. We've been jealous for years of helical CT, where you press a button and boom, it goes. Well, that, I think, is where we're heading. Big green go button on the screen. You say, I want to start here, I want to end here, I want this range of contrasts. Now just keep on acquiring. Don't stop if the patient moves. Don't stop between. Just keep on acquiring. Gather as much complementary information as you can. Use those sparse samples in dense dimensions. And then reconstruct what you want in a complementary way after the fact. This, as I see it, is the rapid imaging renaissance. And I've shown to superimpose this here on a Renaissance-era clock, which at the time was still showing the geocentric model of the universe, not knowing at the time that that model was about to become defunct. I think we are at a bit of a similar situation in the field of rapid imaging, and it will be an uncomfortable and extremely exciting time. So with that, I want to acknowledge some of the people who have supported this work. I want to particularly call out support from the NIH, who have recently funded our Center for Advanced Imaging Innovation and Research, which does a lot of this kind of work. It's one of our key missions. And actually, we are sharing a lot of our code and data related to these kinds of continuous acquisitions on our website there, if you're interested. I want to thank the remarkable team of people who teach me everything I know day to day in radiology research, and then finish by thanking my home team, without whom my life in particular would not be possible. So thank you very much for your attention.